Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the next installment of the Rocky Mountain MyRec Short Takes on Suicide Prevention podcast. I'm your host, Adam Hoffberg, and joining me today is Duane France. Duane and I met probably a couple of years ago through the VA Mental Health Summits and Community Mental Health Summits, and it's been really a pleasure getting to know him and hearing about the exciting work that he's doing to promote veterans' mental health in the community. Duane is the Director of Veteran Services with the Family Care Center, and he also writes and speaks about veteran mental health through his Headspace and Timing blog and podcast. So welcome, Duane.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks, Adam.
So welcome, Duane. We're really glad to have you on here today. Maybe let's just start off with a little bit about yourself and what you bring to the space of veterans' mental health.
Oh, I appreciate that, too. So I am a retired Army non-commissioned officer. I spent 22 years in the Army, joined in the early 90s, so I'm one of those that sort of spanned the pre- and post-9/11 spectrum. I have, when I was in the Army, I was not a mental health professional. I was in logistics and did a lot of support for light infantry divisions, was in the 82nd back in the late 90s. I finished up with 5 separate deployments, one Iraq, 2 Afghanistan's, North Africa. I finished out my career with 10th Special Forces Group, and then Bosnia way back in the last century in the mid-90s. And as I was retiring, we always think about, what we're going to be when we grow up. And I really found that I had an interest in psychology in general. And then as I started getting into it, there's a natural progression, I think, between the sort of leadership, lending the ear and hey, Joe, what's going on, to more formal training as a clinician. So I got my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling in 2015, and I've been working with an organization in Colorado Springs that's doing some different things, mainly working with justice-involved veterans in the Veterans Court. I've been doing that since January of 14, even through my practicum and internship, and then continuing on with that and really looking at how can community mental health providers collaborate with and support the mission of the VA, and sort of we're all addressing the same needs. So currently I am a clinician, a practicing clinician, but also run our veterans programs for our community agency. But as you mentioned, I also write and speak about veteran mental health on my own podcast and blog, Headspace and Timing, because we mental health professionals don't always do a very good job in communicating to those that we're trying to help. And so I found it really beneficial to be able to sort of balance both of those things. Great.
That's a nice intro, and I really want to dive a little bit more into how you're sort of wearing multiple hats in this scene. So, as a veteran, you've had multiple deployments and tons of experience, and then as a clinician, you're bringing this training and mental health expertise. So, tell us a little bit more about how that impacts your work.
Well, I think that it's beneficial to have lived experience. This is even going back to Jung and the archetype of the wounded healer of when Jung was looking around, he saw some of the best psychoanalysts in his time had overcome the issues that they were trying to help other people overcome. Definitely not comparing myself to Jung or his contemporaries, but the idea of having the lived experience of knowing what it's like. I can find Ramadi on a map, and I know what it's like to almost literally be hanging off the side of a mountain in Afghanistan. But also it's beneficial to sort of cut through some immediate rapport kind of thing. You come into my office and it looks like a retired first sergeant's office, right? I got maps on the walls and coins on the table. And so it can help veterans really get to a place of understanding. And not to say that any clinician that needs to that's working with veterans has to be a veteran. I have many colleagues, both in and out of the VA, who never served in the military, and they're extremely competent in working with veterans. I know that for me, I'm a native to the culture, so to speak, and we talk a lot about cultural competence. And I think it benefits me to be able to say to the veteran or sometimes the military spouse that I'm working with that I know the lifestyle, but I also have this clinical training and the work that I'm doing as far as keeping up with the clinical research and a lot of the stuff that's coming out of Rocky Mountain MyRec, and so having both the lived experience and the clinical training really makes it beneficial for a lot of veterans to be able to get to a place of ease soon. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. So let's turn to your work with the Veterans Services Family Care Center. I was really intrigued when you said you work with justice-involved vets, and that's definitely an area that we're really interested in covering and helping sort of shed some light on what's going on in this area. So could you tell us a little bit about the work you're doing in that area?
Yeah, so here in Colorado Springs is the 4th Judicial District Veterans Trauma Court, and this is one of the first trauma courts in the nation. Of course, it started out, many who understand the history of the Veterans Courts, the first, I think, major official one was in Buffalo. But this court was constituted in El Paso County and Teller County, 4th Judicial District, in 2009. And so we've expanded. I think we're up to 6 veterans courts in the states. There's veterans courts throughout the nation. And the idea is that the reasons for misbehavior in 2008 or 2018 are very different than the reasons for misbehavior in 1998, for example. I mean, we understand that exposure to combat and multiple stressors do make an impact on an individual's, mental health, but also their behavior. And so as I was getting ready to transition out of the military in 2014, the court had already been there for a couple of years, and my agency that I came to work with had already been working with the Veterans Court in 2012. There are many different veterans courts throughout the country, and they have different criteria. But one of the unique ones about the El Paso County Veterans Court here in Colorado is that we have a mix of participants in the court program that aren't necessarily eligible for VA services. We have 5 military installations down here. We have it's the only county in the United States that has 5 active military installations within its geographic boundaries, so we have a large military population. And then we also have those veterans that, for one reason or another don't qualify for the Department of Veterans Affairs, whether it's, obviously we talk a lot about bad paper and the needs for those, to caring for those veterans, for whatever reason they got out of the service with that characterization. But also, sometimes we have the ability to maybe react quickly to sort of bridge the veteran until we can get into the VA. If there's some specialized treatment that they might need that might have a longer wait period, and so we provide the community support in conjunction with our Veterans Justice Outreach folks down here to be able to give a mental health provider aspect to the team that's also trying to address the judicial aspect.
So are you consulting with the team to help them sort of understand, recognize, and respond to some of the mental health needs of these veterans going through the program, or?
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of it has to do with, what is the, what are we dealing with kind of thing. We do, preliminary assessments to determine if a veteran's even appropriate for the program. Not all veterans who are involved in the criminal justice system are appropriate for this type of program, and this program always isn't appropriate for every veteran. So we do some of that, but also it's a matter of, if we're going to talk about veteran mental health, then of course mental health professionals can and should be involved. And when it comes to mental health, and especially justice-involved veterans' mental health, we have specialty courts like, recovery court for substance abuse, domestic violence court for those type of situations, DUI court, and they're very specialized in addressing that particular problem. Well, what we see with veterans is you have all of that combined in the same individual, right? You can have a veteran who has had a couple of DUIs, who has experienced some domestic crisis that resulted in a domestic violence charge, as well as having the psychological concerns, PTSD, TBI, purpose and meaning. And so being able to have a program that sort of encapsulates all of that, and then me and my colleague, as well as, again, our VJO, are able to sort of give the psychological and the mental health point of view for the team as a whole.
Nice. Really important work. With your work at the Veteran Services Family Care Center, you also mentioned you work sometimes with the spouses and kind of take a more holistic approach there. Tell us a little bit about, some of the counseling work that you do.
Right. So when and this actually is something that arose out of our work with the Veterans Court, is we all know that at least if an E6 or a captain or gets out of the military after 6 or 7 years, they have support from the VA. But many times those spouses or family members that served with that veteran don't have a lot of that same mental health support. This is a big gap that we see in the community. My wife and I just celebrated our 20th anniversary, and she was with me out of 4 of my 5 deployments. She experienced those deployments in a very different way than I did. And so many times it can be beneficial to be able to have an opportunity for military spouses to come in. So our agency does, of course, accept TRICARE. We do a lot with, retirees and active duty family members here with Fort Carson and Peterson Air Force Base. But we also have a grant-funded program that we're currently in our 3rd year of that enables us to be able to provide some of that gap support for those individuals that may not have access to services. So we do support military spouses, and again, family being defined whatever the way that the veteran does. It doesn't mean you have to be, officially married. It can just be long-term girlfriend. It can be, just a caregiver for a veteran. And so in that way, we see ourselves as a complementary to the VA. We are a choice provider for both medications and mental health. I sort of term ourselves as a civilian vet center. So if your listeners are familiar with the way the vet centers work, that's really what we're trying to do to be able to sort of cover those gaps that may exist in the community.
Yeah, I love that. And obviously also I want to say congratulations. 20 years is no small feat.
No, and especially, I mean, and many people, many veterans, and it sometimes doesn't work that long, and especially with our multiple deployments. I think there was not a solid year between 2006 and 2013 where I wasn't gone for most, if not all, of the year. And so, working through that can definitely put a strain on the relationship. But also, and as well as I do, the studies show that a strong supportive relationship can also be beneficial to veteran mental health, right? So veteran mental health impacts the family, and the family impacts veteran mental health. And so addressing, as you said, the entire comprehensive part of it is really important.
We also keep touching on this idea of your lived experience and expertise, and I was wondering, a lot of the research and a lot of our experience working with veterans is that sometimes the transition out of the military is one of the most difficult times. And also we know in some cases this is a period of heightened suicide risk. So I was just wondering, how your experience was and what any lessons learned or things you wanted to say about your transition experience out of the military.
Yeah, certainly. I tend to say that I had an atypical transition. In looking at it, I recognized that I was extremely blessed to be able to have, quote unquote, a smooth transition. But if I were just looking at it myself, I didn't think it was very smooth. One of the things I think that was different for me is I knew I was already working towards what was going to happen after the military for 5 years before I had gotten out. So, I generally say that I started to plan my transition at 7 years, which is very, very atypical. At that point, I didn't think that I was going to be a mental health professional, but I started thinking about what is life going to be like. I'm not going to be in the military. I have a colleague of mine that says when we're in the military, we need to parallel plan. What is our path if we stay in, and what is our path when we stay out? And the sooner we can do that is better. And so after my second Afghanistan tour, I came back. I knew that my time was winding down. I got sent to an absolutely great unit, spent a couple more years in than I had originally planned, and ended up doing 22 years instead of getting out at the 20 mark. But even then, when we talk about going fully into the transition, my wife and I had started talking about, when do we drop my retirement paperwork? So I really did, or we as a family started to officially move into planning for transition at about 18 months before we got out. And so, people that are listening to this say, wow, you had a lot of time. It didn't seem like a lot of time for me. I mean, it's still, even that much time seemed like, what the heck am I doing? And, like I said, I spent 3 years in the 82nd. A lot of it felt like I was jumping out of an airplane without any, knowledge about where I'm going to land, without a reserve parachute. I mean, and it was an anxious time. Thankfully, I did not. I was able to locate a job. I worked for about 18 months as a program director for a homeless veterans program, which was really beneficial to me to sort of see how that impacted. And then I transitioned into the clinical work that I'm doing now. And so, knocking on wood, I don't have a lot of the challenges that many veterans had gotten out when it came to transition. I had my needs met. I was able to remain employed, and I was able to maintain my housing, and I've got my retirement and all of these different things that provide a sort of stability that keeps me from, or has kept me from really experiencing some of the major stressors. But that's not always the case, and I often say this this experience of when I was a program director at the homeless program. I had a resident of the program who was the same rank as me, was deployed at the same time as me, doing the same job as me, and he was a resident of the program, and I was the program director for the program. And so, while some people may say, oh, yes, you had it easy and you walked in from one job to another, I absolutely recognize the beneficial chance that has come around that's made my transition stable. And I recognize that it could have been just one more deployment or even one more patrol or one more incident when I was in the military, and I could have come home to an empty house, or, and it all goes into some of it was blind luck and, God's provision, and some of it was really a focus on, very deliberately looking at the transition and sort of how do we set this up in a certain way.
That's really powerful, that image in my mind of almost like two brothers that are, the same, and then, there's different paths and ended up in very different places, but that parallel there where, just the idea that the transition is something that you started planning well in advance. And I can see how for a lot of folks that isn't a luxury, or maybe just they hadn't thought that they needed to. And so, they exit the military and end up just sort of stepping into this new life that they hadn't prepared for.
Right, absolutely, and again, I'm not making it sound like, or I guess I am making it sound like everything is wine and roses, but it's not, right? I had 5 deployments, but But two of the deployments were very, very significant. I am diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I've experienced bouts of major depressive disorder. Likely, looking back on it as a clinician, number one, it's something that's probably been there my entire life. But as we often know, those kind of problems get exacerbated when you're in the military. And so, even then the concept of Jung's wounded healer, moving beyond those kind of things. But the best preacher's a former sinner kind of situation. And being able to say, I know what it's like because I've been there, and this is how not just I've gotten out of it, because my every experience is different, but this is how to get out of it. And it takes sort of that the veteran or the veteran's family to really step out and kind of reach out for that help on their own.
So I want to transition now to talking about some of your writing and some of the work that you do outside of the Veteran Services Family Care Center. And in particular, highlight one of your books, which has received, quite a bit of interest online. It's called Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy. Tell us about that writing.
Sure. So, and again, all of this sort of emerged out of some things that really happened during the transition. So, back in 2016, our organization went through a little bit of a shift, and I had been advised to really kind of start, making an online presence and things like that. So I started a blog, and one of the things, again, is that we're not really talking much about mental health. Mental health professionals aren't necessarily talking as much about mental health that we could or should. So, I started doing it. And of course, for me, it's satisfying for me. It's something that I used to do a long time ago. So this is one of the things that I rediscovered after my military career that I hadn't written in a very long time, and I enjoy writing. So that book, the Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy book, is actually the second book, and really everything kind of ties in together, because the first book that I put out that's currently an ebook was generally a collection of blog posts that I put together. In El Paso County Jail, on any given day, there's 150 to 200 incarcerated veterans. Again, in our jail and other, this is starting to take on around the nation, is they're actually putting veterans all in the same ward or the same pod or the same cell block. And so a number of veterans came to me and said, hey, we want to start a group, and it is still going on. This group's name is Warriors First. But they wanted to start a group where they would actually talk about different topics, and they wanted a number of articles or a number of information, something like, the Blue Book, when we go to AA and you read, a portion of the Blue Book, and then you talk about whatever that, or the Big Book, and you talk about whatever that is, the topic of the day. And so I originally put together, 52 separate articles, and they used that, and they still do use that here in our county jail, and now they're actually using it at the state level, because there's a veterans cell block at the state penitentiary in Sterling. And so that's really how the idea of the books came out, is another way to be able to kind of communicate this information. So the Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy book is a compilation of articles grouped together in certain concepts that, like you said, it really, the audience is threefold, essentially, the service member and the veteran themselves, to help them understand, hey, look, I'm not crazy. Just because I went to combat, just because, I jump at loud sounds, it doesn't make me crazy. It means that, that this is an experience just like any other. But also, it has helped family members to understand, or those that are working with veterans to understand, that, there is this stigma of the crazy combat vet. We come up against these stereotypes of the veteran as a villain, right? And especially if we're talking about justice-involved veterans, but the idea of, well, you went to combat, so it's going to end up like John Rambo taking over the town. Or there's the stereotype of the victim, right? The oh, you poor baby. I actually had another clinician, and we were at a retreat in California, And he says, "Oh, I love working with veterans. Oh, they're so wounded and so fragile, and three-legged dog and a broken-winged bird." And me and the other veterans were very offended because we're not that. We're not victims. And then also you hear it all the time that we're not heroes either, right? We're human as the rest of them. So that's really what the writing has been able to try to communicate, and the book has really tried to do, is to say, give people a glimpse of what most people are not understanding about the military, and specifically focused on mental health.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned some of these stereotypes that are very pervasive, and it's unfortunate. And I feel like we read about them in the media. We, see them in character portrayals on various, cinema and things like that. And it's so powerful to hear you talk today, and also, to hear all these veterans that you may hopefully be influencing who are going through, a rough patch in their life, to really see, yeah, combat doesn't make you crazy. We aren't a stereotype. We're humans. Everybody's dynamic and diverse. And I'm just glad that you're putting that out there.
Right, and these are the critical conversations, because veterans are thinking this inside their own mind, right? It's, well, of course I must be crazy. Everybody's treating me like I'm crazy, so if they're treating me like a horse, then I must be a horse, kind of thing. And really to be able to say, no, this is, and we talk about it often, it's so much that it might be cliche. It's a natural reaction to an abnormal situation and things like that. But we're emerging into, or really not emerging into, we're 17 years into a form of conflict that really has not been known in current memory, or even through the history of our nation. Before, we would talk about two war vets as someone as being in, World War II and then Korea, or Korea then Vietnam, or Vietnam then the Persian Gulf War. I can rightly be considered a two-war vet, but it's simultaneous. It's not consecutive, and it's repetitive, right? The World War II heroes, and definitely see them as that. They went there until the job was done, spent 3-4 years in Europe or in the Pacific, and then came back to their homes, and there was this time before and after. It's rare for a Vietnam veteran to have more than 2 tours, definitely more than 3 tours. Now I am actually on the low end of individuals that have had combat tours through the global war on terror, because I had 4, arguably. The last one was to North Africa, not necessarily combat, but then it was going home. It was coming back. It was it was going there, and so understanding that the different environment that we're working in here, we have to communicate that to veterans and change the way that we think about ourselves, while we're also trying to change the way that the veteran and the community think and talk about veteran mental health.
Great. Well, we will absolutely include some links to this work so folks can take a deeper dive. Obviously, we can't cover everything in one conversation today. But I did want to talk also a little bit more about your writing and also your podcast. And, it was kind of helpful to hear that your writing started off as blogging and then it kind of morphed into a full-on book. And so I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about your path to podcasting. And I understand you're approaching now your 100th episode.
Yes, and just like with my writing, I thought that I'd run out of stuff to talk about years ago almost, right? And so the podcasting has also come out of the blog, and the blog had come out of what I was hearing from the veterans in the clinical space. So as I had started writing, and some of my veteran colleagues and some of our mental health colleagues had started to say, hey, come on and have a conversation about the work that you're doing. So I was on a number of different podcasts, veteran-focused podcasts, back in the beginning of 2017. And I ended up on a podcast called the Change Your POV podcast. It's run by a couple of veterans, a Marine Corps veteran, Bennett Tanton, and an Army veteran, Eddie Lazary. And they had a show that focused on really sort of that transition aspect of, interviewing, but they also occasionally talk to things that you've talked about on your show, like moral injury, and what's the difference between moral injury and PTSD. So after I went on their show as a guest, they reached out to me and said, "Hey, how about you do your own show?" And of course, I have a congenital birth defect against saying no to anything. Welcome to the Headspace and Timing Podcast, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes around veteran mental health. My name is Duane France, and I'm a retired Army non-commissioned officer and a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After retiring from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, then you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set correctly, however, it was just a useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support service members, veterans, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. So I said, sure, why not? Not realizing, and not that it's it is a time commitment. But it was another way to be able to communicate this. And so in July 4th, 2017 was our first show. We launched on the Change Your POV podcast network. And my focus is really to bring on veteran service members who have experienced their own mental health journey, to highlight mental health professionals, to be able to let veterans know, hey, there are people out there who understand and who get what you're doing, and also different programs and how they impact mental health. And so, as you said, we are approaching our 100th episode, and we just recently transitioned to a standalone podcast. Before, we were part of a group of podcasts on the same channel. But we've had some really great conversations. I think definitely you and I have had some of these communications between. We had Joseph Currier on the show out of the University of South Alabama talking about moral injury. And I had the extreme honor of having Dr. Shira McGinn from the VA talking about sort of the origins and the history of moral injury. So we've had a lot of really great conversations about veteran mental health, and really about how we're trying to change the way that we're thinking and talking about it and getting it out in the open. Excellent.
Yeah. Is there any, I know you just gave a few examples, but is there any particular episode that really has stuck with you throughout this time that you've run the podcast?
Yes, actually, and there's a couple, and then there's one that's going to be coming up that has really blown me away. But one of my favorite was probably one of the earliest, in which I had a conversation with Brian Dories of the Theater of War Project. And if your listeners haven't heard of this, this is where Brian takes the work of Philoctetes, I think, in the story of Ajax, and shows how during the Trojan War, in that particular play, he ends up taking his own life, and they actually, the Theater of War Project was created out of the Department of Defense, and it really helps. It tells the current tale in old language. And Brian is an example of someone who had never served, had never even had military experience in his background, but yet had this certain skill set and recognized in ancient literature the same things that were happening when he was talking to mental health professionals. And Brian is someone, we talk about the civilian-military divide, Brian is someone on the civilian side who's trying to step into that gap and in many ways translate the military experience for the service member or for the civilians as well. So that has always been a particularly strong episode. I've got a lot of feedback about it, about how it just his passion about it, and then just how some of the things that he talks about kind of hits home. The other show is actually one that's going to be coming up. So
I just wanted to say, I really love and find it so powerful when, art helps share that story. And I'm looking forward to checking that episode out. So thanks for sharing that.
Yes, I mean, that is in definitely, again, I think, I've had people, friends of mine have called me up and said, yeah, maybe this is a trigger warning, I don't know, but they were listening to it on the way to work, and they said they had to sit in the parking lot for a few minutes and gather themselves together because it's that powerful. And not powerful because of anything that I did, but just Brian's passion about his subject and just the story of the theater of war. And then similarly, I've got another show that's shortly to be released as we're recording this with Sarah Verardo of the Independence Fund. And as we're at this point, I think I've recorded well over 100 episodes, and just her story, her personal story. I've probably not been as emotionally moved as I was when I was listening to her story and her passion. She is a caregiver of a catastrophically wounded, both physically and psychologically, veteran, and just any one of the things that she's doing is amazing, but just everything all together, she is an example of someone who can help influence other caregivers and can really give a different look at sort of the costs of what we've been doing for the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're doing some really fantastic work, some really excellent guests on your show. So I do encourage our listeners to check out the Headspace and Timing podcast. Duane, I know, we can't possibly cover everything today, but I did want to, first of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be on the show today, and also kind of give you an opportunity to kind of put in some parting thoughts and closing words before we let you go today.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think the biggest thing that I've experienced, and this goes back to something we hadn't touched on, is my father and three of my uncles were Vietnam veterans. My younger brother and I are both Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, and there's going to be some long-term impacts. This is the first cross-generational war in which this past year is the first time that someone not born on 9/11 could enlist in the military with their parents' permission and go fight in the same war that they literally weren't alive when it really started. And that's never happened, especially in recent memories, but even in the U.S. The oldest, we're probably 5 or 10 years away from, the oldest global war on terror veteran hitting 65. And the youngest global war on terror veteran has probably not joined the military yet. And so understanding what this long-term psychological impact is going to be, it's critical. And if we start getting out in front of it like you do with your show, and we literally start talking about veteran mental health as common as it was talking about the weather, then I think that we're going to be ahead of the curve whenever the need arises in the future.
Mm-hmm. Really well said, and some great thoughts to marinate on, So listeners, I hope you really took as much away from today as I did. And Duane, as we mentioned, has a huge presence online, so of course we welcome you to follow up directly, shoot us some questions, give us some comments, feedback, subscribe to Duane's podcast, and give it a listen. Until next time, join us for more interviews on important work in veterans' mental health, suicide prevention, and resilience. Thanks, Duane.
No, thank you. I had a great time.